I'm so pleased to see the interest in this event, Call to Mind, Listening to Caregivers. We have nearly 300 people joining us tonight. Most of them are online, and we're actually competing with the Stanley Cup hockey playoffs in Alberta, so I'm pretty pleased that we've gotten so much interest in this topic. I'm Dr. Debra Sheets. I'm a professor in the School of Nursing and a research fellow with the Institute on Aging and Lifelong Health, and your host tonight. And I'm the host of the Call to Mind podcast. May is BC Caregiver Month, and tonight we're recognizing and honoring the significant contributions of family caregivers. Before we start our program, it's important to offer our acknowledgement of respect for the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wassanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Okay, I wanted to just provide a little context for the podcast so that tonight we're gonna do a little bit of listening. We've got a wonderful panel of experts, distinguished people, and then we're going to have a chance to have you ask some questions and talk about this topic a bit. But I wanted you to know that the idea for Call to Mind podcast emerged in the early days of COVID. I'm one of the founders, along with Dr. Stuart McDonald in the back room there, of the Voices in Motion choirs. We had 6 intergenerational community-based choirs for people living with dementia, family caregivers, and high school students before COVID launched. It was really clear that people living with memory loss suffer a lot of social isolation and loneliness, and the choir really became a community and a place for them to have fun, to have make social connections, and to regain an identity of themselves. You know, when you have memory loss, so many things fall away. And so they began to think of themselves as singers, and they're really very good. When the choirs couldn't meet in person anymore, a really important part of their lives was lost, and they continue to meet online, but it isn't quite the same. And so Suzanne Ahern, our communications officer at UVic in the back there, she came up with the idea really of this podcast. Like, why don't we do some audio diaries and really tap into some of the intimate personal reflections on caregiving and on living with memory loss and see what we come up with. So I think although we all felt isolation and loneliness during the pandemic, it was particularly felt by caregivers and persons living with dementia. And you'll hear a lot of music in the podcast excerpts we share because the caregivers we invited to participate were all members of the Voices in Motion choir. So they were all singers, and music was really important in their life. The resulting audio was edited into some of the stories, the excerpts that you'll hear tonight, and you can listen to the 30-minute full podcasts on the calltomindpodcast.com website. While there are quite a lot of podcasts that focus on caregiving, most are really concerned with education, with what services are out there, and the narratives of dementia often lack the voice of the caregiver. They're more focused around the person living with dementia. So our goal was to bring a personal perspective into this topic by sharing caregiver stories and making the invisible support that caregivers provide more visible and helping to deepen empathy and understanding of dementia and caregiving. 87% of caregivers of persons living with memory loss say they wish that more people understood the realities of caring for someone with dementia. And many caregivers ultimately, they sacrifice a lot. They have financial, mental, and physical health strains as a result of the caregiving they provide. Nearly 1/2 of caregivers for family members with memory loss report the stress, and this is much higher than caregivers who are caring for someone with physical disabilities. So our 4-part podcast shares personal stories of love and loss and caregiving for someone with memory loss specifically. And the stories that we found, we didn't know what we would get, are really powerful. They're intimate, they're engaging, and they also provide a very honest glimpse into the challenges and also the rewards of caregiving. We wanted a balanced view. It isn't, people are afraid of dementia because they hear such terrifying and tragic stories so often. But there's also tender moments, poignant moments. Dementia can point us to living in the moment, to being really truly present. And the most important thing a caregiver can do perhaps is to really take the time to be there and not be so consumed with all the different tasks of daily living, the shopping, the doctor visits, the things that can really encroach on the time when you really connect with that person that you love. So that there are some very poignant moments in the podcast. They show how fleeting and precious time is. There are also some struggles, crises, and moments of exhaustion. And but we also show, these rewards of caregiving. All of us will either be a caregiver, need caregiving, or know someone who is a caregiver. So each of us can learn from these stories depending on where we're sitting at this time. Right now, there are over 1 million caregivers in BC that provide care for a family member, friend, or a neighbor, and that's 1 in 4 of us. Family caregivers are really the unsung heroes of our healthcare system. They provide 75% of the care needed by older Canadians living at home. Only 1 in 5 Canadians who need long-term care are actually in a nursing home. Most of them are out here in the community. More and more people in the years ahead are going to need support in their homes to manage medications, support for activities of daily living like bathing and cooking and housekeeping. But right now, there really is inadequate support for them. And so we shift that work to family caregivers who step in as nurses, housekeepers, and receive very little support. Our healthcare system needs to recognize the strains on caregivers. Families are shrinking, they're scattered across space geographically, and the pressure on individual caregivers is reaching a breaking point. Right now, there's no national strategy to support caregivers, and we may all find ourselves at some point in our lives struggling, and it's really a tragedy if we find ourselves alone during this very vulnerable time in our lives. So tonight we're going to listen to the excerpts, and we'll begin with that, and then our panel will explore some of the issues with you and allow you to ask your Q&As. Before we get started, though, first I'm going to introduce our moderator, Jen Lyle. And Jen is the CEO, the Chief Executive Officer for the Alzheimer Society of BC. And prior to joining the Alzheimer Society, she was the founding CEO of BC's Continuing Care Workplace Safety Association, SafeCare BC. She's previously worked in a dual role as a healthcare practitioner and director of operations for a Burnaby-based rehab organization and has collaborated on research looking at the impact of design on people living with dementia. She has a Bachelor of Science degree from Simon Fraser University and a Master of Health Administration from the University of BC. So I'm going to turn it over to Jen, and thank you for coming tonight with all that wind out there.
Thank you, Deborah, and it's a pleasure to be here with all of you here today. And I thought, the Call to Mind podcast series is really about telling stories. So I thought it would be quite fitting to open up the discussion today by sharing a story with you. I want to share a story about a couple named Charlene and John. A couple years ago, Charlene started to notice some changes with John. And so after some discussion, they went and saw their family doctor. And so the conversation went how it often goes for people in this situation sometimes at first, where the doctor said, you know what, John, you're in your 60s. Forgetting some stuff, that's normal. But then John started to forget how to do some things he'd previously been very good at, like navigating, for example. So there were some more discussions and some more follow-up with the healthcare providers in their circle. And John eventually received a diagnosis of young onset Alzheimer's disease. Now, if you've been in this situation yourself, or you know somebody who has, you know that you often experience a range of emotions, and no two people respond to that news the same way. For John, he initially struggled with accepting his new reality. For Charlene, although she felt fear at the unknown, fear about what comes next, she also felt relief, because suddenly there was a name, there was a reason for the changes that she was seeing. The other thing that we know that sometimes happens is when people receive this news, whether they receive a diagnosis themselves or it's somebody in their family who receives that diagnosis, they don't often share their story. They may not even tell anybody for whatever reason, and very valid reasons at times. But that's not the case with Charlene and John. They told everybody. They told everybody in their circle. Charlene started journaling. She started writing because she found it was cathartic, but also because she wanted to share her story, her journey, their journey together with other caregivers, so that maybe in helping process it herself, she could also help somebody else who's going through the same journey feel a little less alone. She even approached the local media to share some of her stories. The other thing that Charlene did is she connected with the Alzheimer Society BC. So she attended our workshop, she attended our webinar, she got connected to other caregivers. And in doing so, in sharing her story, she created and connected into a larger community of support. And not only that, but by collectively sharing their story, John and Charlene also learned just how loved John was. The reason why I'm sharing this story with you is to underscore the impact that sharing stories has. Because when we hear somebody else's story and that touches on elements of our own life or experiences that we've had, we connect with that. And that helps us feel maybe just a little less alone, a little less isolated. Maybe it even helps inspire us to share our own story, and in doing so, reach out for help. So that's why I'm so pleased to be part of this discussion here today, to be talking about the stories that are in the Call to Mind podcast, but also the broader issues. And we've got some great panelists to do so, to have that conversation here today. A couple housekeeping items before we jump into things. So for all of you who are joining us on the live webcast today, welcome. One thing that you'll note, don't worry, we will not be looking into your living rooms. You won't see yourself on the video, you'll just see us on the video. So rest assured, you're all good there. But there will be Q&A during the session. So after the discussion, there'll be an opportunity for Q&A. You'll note in the live stream option, there's a Q&A button that you can click on. You can just input your questions in there. Please indicate who you'd like me to ask the question to. Otherwise, I will use my moderator privileges and I'll choose for you. For those of us who are in the audience, welcome. We're so pleased that you're here to join us today. And you'll note that you would have received an index card on your way in. You can use that to write your questions down during the session. And then I believe either Deborah or Leah or one of our awesome volunteers will be walking around and collecting them just before the Q&A portion. Again, please make sure you indicate who you want me to ask the question to, or I get to choose. The last thing that I'll say too is we're going to first start by listening to an excerpt from the Call to Mind podcast. It's actually a compilation, snippets of the 4 different episodes. These stories are intimate and they're surprising. They're uplifting. They also talk about the challenges of being a caregiver, the impact of social isolation, but they also talk about 2 stories of love and relationship at a time when everything is changing. So we'll listen to that podcast in a few quick seconds. I'm also going to quickly introduce the wonderful panelists who are here with me today. We'll have a chance to get to know them a little bit better, but we're joined here today by Isabel Mckenzie, the Seniors Advocate from the Office of the Seniors Advocate of BC. We have Barb McLean from Family Caregivers of BC, and we have Brenda Brophy, who is a family caregiver and a Call to Mind storyteller as well. So we'll get to hear from them and learn a bit more about them in a moment, but we're going to play that excerpt for you now.
This is Call to Mind, a podcast series from the University of Victoria, audio stories of love and memory loss.
Oh, it's a beautiful morning.
Lovely, isn't it?
Oh, it's a beautiful day. I had a wonderful feeling. Everything's going my way.
Do you know who I am?
No,
Not at all.
not really.
Oh, okay. I'm Brenda, your daughter.
Oh, my daughter,
Brenda Lee.
Brenda Lee.
Yeah.
I'd love to get into the world of coaching people who look after people with dementia, because there's certain things that you learn along the way. And one of them is you take every minute of respite. It's interesting. The thing I've learned about dementia is the emotions stay and the memories leave. Even now, if she starts crying about something, when she finishes crying, later she'll go, was I crying? I feel sad. Why was I sad? Yeah, she can remember that, but just not the memory.
All right, Mother, how you feeling? You feeling a little better?
Sad, but
Sad.
I don't know why
today
I'm
you-
sad.
Oh, let's see. Can we do this one? Okay, What's that? Who's here? Chris. He's my son. He's your son. And you're his brother. I'm his sister. He's my brother. Yeah. You read your paper, eat your grapes. I'll stoke the fire. I'm so glad you're here. But you've been here all along, have you? Yeah. Yep.
In this podcast series, people living with Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia record audio diaries and conversations about their lives during the pandemic. I'm your host, Debra Sheets, a nursing professor and researcher with the Institute on Aging and Lifelong Health at the University of Victoria.
I know that I can't do the things I used to do. You forgot the Kleenex.
I know, I got a ring. Mickey's a crier. But Mickey's always been a crier. She's somebody who, you know, cries through all the Hallmark commercials and.
No, I don't.
Yes, you do.
We had our first kiss in the snow under the street light.
Yes.
Right. And then, after the poker game,
Yeah,
you came home with me
that's right.
and stayed.
That's right.
And that was the beginning of our 42 years together.
And if people can get music into their brain, then that, I think, is a wonderful thing to have if you have dementia, as I do.
How would you say that you're now coping with dementia? How would you say, what are the things you like to do now in your daily life that maybe weren't part of your daily life at one time?
Well, I got advice from people telling me that riding a bicycle is always a good thing to do. You have to keep upright and things like that. The other thing is learning a musical instrument, and I had played a piano and done things like that before, but and now I have this, what's it called? Banjo ukulele, and I've been hammering away on that since August, and I think I can make some intelligent noises on it, and I can play the banjo ukulele better than I can talk, and so we're doing one thing for us anyway.
So that was certainly something new that you learned, wasn't it?
Yes, it
that
was.
you have found to be very, very helpful. In fact, I think you told me once, if you didn't sort of play the banjo ukulele first thing in the morning for a while, you just felt that you weren't yourself, that you really
Yes.
think it's important.
And so I get up and I wake everybody up by playing the banjo ukulele, and everybody really loves to be woken up that way.
In each half-hour episode, you'll hear intimate and surprising stories about the challenges and rewards of caregiving, the impacts of isolation, finding joy by living in the present, and staying in love when everything else is changing. We hope this podcast inspires you to make your community a more friendly and supportive place for people with dementia. This 4-part podcast series was made possible by the University of Victoria, with funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, the Alzheimer Society of Canada, the Alzheimer Society of BC, and Michael Smith Health Research BC. Follow Call to Mind now in your favorite podcast app. To see photos, read storyteller bios, and access episode transcriptions, go to our website at calltomindpodcast.com. Share it with someone you love.
You can't help but feel the intimacy in those moments, hey? Like you've been invited into somebody's living room, that you're part of their life. You're sitting down having a cup of tea maybe with them and just learning a little bit about them. One thing I will mention as well, just before we hear from our first panelist, Isabel Mckenzie, is that this event is being recorded, and so it will be posted to the Call to Mind podcast website later, as well as the website for the Institute on Aging and Lifelong Health. But now it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Isabel Mckenzie. Isabel Mckenzie is the representative from the Office of the Seniors Advocate, and this office is responsible for monitoring and analyzing senior services and issues here in BC. It also makes recommendations to government and service providers to address systemic issues. The office provides information and referrals for individuals who are navigating senior services and tracks their concerns, so that helps inform future work. The services which the office monitors are in 5 key areas. There's healthcare, housing, income supports, community supports, and transportation. The office collaborates with service providers, government, and health authority to improve effectiveness, efficiency, and outcomes. A council of advisors made up of BC seniors provides the Seniors Advocate with advice and feedback from the perspective of seniors with diverse backgrounds, ages, geographical areas, and cultures. Each year, the Seniors Advocate must report to the Minister of Health on the office's activities and reports wherever possible on issues and matters arising from the office's work. And I know many of you in this room are probably familiar with the work that's come out of Isabel's office as well. Isabel Mckenzie herself has over 20 years of experience working with seniors in home care, licensed care, community services, and volunteer services. Isabel led BC's largest not-for-profit agency, serving over 6,000 seniors annually. In this work, Isabel led the implementation of a new model of dementia care that has become a national best practice and led the first safety accreditation for home care workers. Among many other accomplishments, Isabel has been widely recognized for her work and was named BC CEO of the Year for the not-for-profit sector and nominated a provincial healthcare hero. Prior to her appointment as the Seniors Advocate, Isabel served on a number of national and provincial boards and commissions, including the BC Medical Services Commission, the Canadian Home Care Association, BC Care Providers Association, the BC Care Aid and Community Health Worker Registry, and the Capital Regional District Housing Corporation. Isabel also served on the University of Victoria's Board of Governors. Isabel received both her undergraduate and graduate degrees from the University of Victoria, so this is home turf for you, and has a certificate in health leadership from the University of Toronto. Over to you, Isabel.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you who are listening out there in your living rooms, and thanks to all of you in the room tonight, and great thanks to Debra for all the work that she does and for organizing this. And I think my reflections on family caregiving is that, we talk a lot about family caregivers, but a lot of people, it is simply they are family. And before they got to the point of assisting people with bathing or feeding or some of the other intricacies of care, they were that person's spouse, they were that person's child, they were that person's grandchild, that there's a whole relationship that built up over time. And that a lot of people don't see themselves as caregivers. They see themselves as a wife, a husband, a son, a daughter, a grandchild, a neighbor, a lifelong friend, who's simply doing what we do in society. We help those people who need help. But I think the challenge is that in the aging process, for some people, not for all, those challenges and that help we need can become significant. And again, not for everybody, but for some. And that there's this line suddenly we cross from, we're just doing what we're expected to do to, we're doing a lot of things here. And one of the other things that I think, particularly when spouses are caregivers, that we may not pay, sorry, I got something in my throat, enough attention to, and I think it might be reflected in data we have that shows us people who care for people with dementia are much more likely to experience distress than people caring for people without dementia, but who have high physical care needs, right? And I think that one of the challenges we're not recognizing is, in addition to the physical burden of caregiving, and we talk about the emotional burden of caring for someone with short-term memory loss. We talk about the repetitiveness of this, but I can't help but believe there isn't a profound emotional reaction to watching that person change. So in the spousal relationship, it's this partner in life that was your equal that you are now caring for. And for adult children, it's this parent who protected you and to whom you turn to for the help. And now those roles are reversed. And none of us come equally prepared to the role of caregiving. Some people love their mums and dads and their spouses deeply. They're not good caregivers, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I think that our reaction to our role as a caregiver is different as well. And I don't think we spend enough time understanding that impact and maybe understanding how how these differences in the relationship with the person we're now the caregiver for has changed and impacted us. Some people embrace it. Some people frankly resent their loved one. They love their mom or dad or husband or wife deeply, and they are really resentful that this has happened. And we have to do a better job of making all of us understand the frailty we all have, and that as we go through this journey of life, some of us are going to need some help. Some of us are going to need a lot of help. Some of us are going to be helped. Some of us are going to be helpers. Some of us are going to gone from being the helper to being helped. And we really need to look at that, I think, and understand what that really means. Because there's, it's an interesting thing, and I know Barb we'll talk about this a lot. We talk in our worlds about the burden, right, of being a caregiver, and we focused a lot on, how do we bring relief to the burdened caregiver? And an amazingly funny thing happened in COVID when we shut the family members out of the care homes. There was a burden to no longer being able to be that caregiver. That was a revelation to me, frankly. I think to a lot of people. I'm not sure they'll all admit it, but we never thought about the burden of not being able to be with your loved one, not being able to be there to comb their hair, not being able to be there to help them eat. We've always focused on the burden of having to do those things. So when we realized the burden on a person when they can't be that helper, you begin to understand this deep connection that's there for some people. It's not there for everybody, sadly. I wish it were. It's not. But for the people that it's there for, it's extremely profound. And as I say, when people were distressed because now I can't go and give the care, and you realize that really there's two people in the equation, the person who's caring and the person who's being cared for, because outside of the professional environment, they're doing it because they love that person. Usually it's a family member, but not always. Sometimes it's lifelong friends. Sometimes, to be fair, we use the term family caregiver because it sounds better than unpaid caregiver. I don't like that term. That's a very harsh term. But I think we need to understand that there's two people, and a lot of times it will be about dementia. That brings with it a set of complexities. I do think intuitively that one of the reasons why there's the higher rate of stress in caring for the person with dementia to some extent is that as much as we intellectually know what's happening, you can't see the struggles in the mind the way you can see the struggles in the physical body when you're caring for somebody who has physical, you know it's not their fault. You know they can't get out of the wheelchair. You know they can't. And yet I think whether it's in We All Live in Hope, there's a part of us who just wants to believe, you can get this. You come on, you can't, what do you mean? I just told you this, right? So when you think about, that's an added dimension to it as well, that there's, in paid caregiving, there's the bundle of stressors and issues around physical stress, around the emotional toll, around all of that. We'll take that entire package and add to it, this is my husband, this is my wife, this is my mom, this is my dad, this is the person who has been my partner through life, or this is the person who protected me for my entire life, and now they need me, I can no longer turn to them, and it's got to be a huge, huge burden. So those are some of my reflections on caregiving.
Thank you for sharing that, Isabel. And one of the things that I was reflecting on as you were speaking was just really the intersection of relationships. So if you come back to that word, relationships, that you don't stop being a spouse, you don't stop being a daughter, but you also become more, you become something else. And I was thinking too, your comments about the burden of not being there for somebody. I'm reflecting on a few stories right now where a theme came out where people were saying like, my acts of caring are acts of love, and the relationship, how people see them. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on this really important topic, Barbara. And that's a great segue into our next panelist, Barb McLean, because caregiving is complicated. Being a caregiver is complicated, and sometimes a lot of the challenges that are around that is even just knowing what supports and services are available to you as a caregiver. And this is something that a lot of us may be unprepared for, because we don't often, we kind of gradually work our way into the caregiver role. As Isabel, you mentioned, it's more like a turning of a dial, not a flipping of a switch, so to speak. So our next speaker, Barb McLean, is the Executive Director of Family Caregivers of BC. And Family Caregivers of BC is a provincial not-for-profit that proudly and compassionately supports over 1 million people in British Columbia that provide physical and or emotional care to a family member or a friend or a neighbor. And they support caregivers by providing access to information, to access to education, and to supports that enable caregivers to feel more confident and successful in the really important role that they play. As the Executive Director of Family Caregivers of BC, Barb has led a transformation from its roots as a community-based local program to a provincial organization, which, as I mentioned, has reached over 1 million caregivers within the first 5 years. Barb's early work supporting children and youth with autism or multiple challenging disabilities gave her the understanding of how family life is transformed and how health, education, and social systems work or fail, and how resilience can be fostered in the face of adversity. In her role as a social worker, she honed her ability to bring people together to creatively solve problems, often informally and in spite of barriers in the system. Barb's been involved in hundreds of research projects, provincial health initiatives, and national forums, bringing a broad understanding of the scope of issues impacting caregivers and a collaborative spirit to advance caregiver-friendly health and social services. Barb's in-laws both lived with dementia, which is added to her insight from her own family experiences. She has a Bachelor of Arts from the University of British Columbia and a Master of Arts in Leadership and Training from Royal Roads University. Barb loves to travel with her family, mostly to anywhere with a lake or an ocean involved. So Barb, over to you.
Thank you, Jen. What a pleasure to be with you all tonight. And I would like to start off my story with just really thanking anyone who shares and tells their story.
The research, really the science is so clear that I could sit, Isabel, we could all talk to you about numbers and statistics and it doesn't hit home. And I've been at this in this particular role for 18 years. And when I sat down yesterday and I listened to your story, Brenda, I cried. And I've heard so many stories. It brought back in the moment for me the power of experience and that we forever need to listen to stories. It's also very personal, exposing to tell your stories. And one of the roles we play at Family Caregivers of BC is we're constantly asked by reporters, researchers, mostly reporters and researchers, could you find a caregiver to tell their story? It's repeated. And we spend a lot of time trying to find that story, and we always hope that it will change. It will change one person's ideas. And even for me, you changed how I was thinking about things. And I'll speak personally about my father-in-law, Doug. He is also 100, as your mom was.
Lovely.
And he's in long-term care in Toronto. He's in a wheelchair now, but he was doing pretty good for a while. He's diabetic and he has about 3 other conditions. The physicians tell our family in our conferences via Zoom, don't be surprised if Doug doesn't last another week. And I had this overpowering feeling of feeling like we had done badly by Doug by not swooping him in during the pandemic and bringing him home. We so badly wanted to do that, but we couldn't. The dynamics of our family just didn't allow for that. And I wonder what would have life been like for him. But he gets on Zoom and he says, I'm happy and where's the ice cream? And so he's quite happy and he's very well cared for. So I think the lesson for me yesterday was, again, honoring the power of story and how much it means when you share it and how much it doesn't help when we remain unwilling to share the real impact of dementia or any other condition. My second story is I was getting my nails done for a birthday present, which is something I don't do. And I know the person very well who is doing my nails finally. She said, finally, Barb. And her phone rang and she went, oh, she looked at her and she said, oh, it's Mom again. And so she picked up and she had the conversation and calmed things down because it's volatile in their household. Aggression is a real area of concern for this family. And she hung up and said, oh, thank God it was you, Barb, because I couldn't possibly do that in front of any other client. And I said, looked at her, I said, why not? When your kids were growing up and the school called and you had an emergency, and there were a few of those in their family, you answered the phone and you weren't embarrassed with clients or to tell people it's the school calling, there's an emergency. What I just heard was an emergency at your house and your mom needs to reach out, and she's the consultation daughter. She calms things down and she desperately needs to be in touch. I said, so maybe think about this. Maybe it's okay to pick up the phone when your clients are doing, maybe they would understand and offer compassion to your situation. And she said, you know, you're right. I would do it for my kids, but I wasn't doing it for my mom and my dad. So that was another thing that I thought about, the power of story and how we actually have to be bold and be brave to break down barriers and to normalize the future that we have is one of a lot of cognitive impairment, a lot of dementia, and a super big, a lot of caregiving. So thank you, Brenda, for sharing your story and everybody else who does that. I want to think about the big picture of care and caregiving to build on what you were saying, Isabel. New research out of U of A, Alberta, looking at $14.7 billion worth of care offered right here in British Columbia by family and friends per year. That translates into over 864 million hours in a year of care. And then finally, that is over 26.5% of people who live in British Columbia that are caregiving. And that is just huge. So if we go to the grocery store, think about it. Somebody there is caring for somebody with dementia. Somebody's there caring for someone with Parkinson's, caring for any reason. And that is a new thing in culture that's a phenomenon that we need to get comfortable with, and we need education and we need support. And we also need a community of understanding that we wrap around each other in our families, our small families, and then our bigger family of our coworkers, and our neighbors. And we will need to dig deep and rely on each other because our system is not going to be able to do it. So we know that there aren't enough beds in long-term care. Right now, recruitment of people that work in home care and that work in the private and the public sectors, there aren't enough of us. So fasten our seatbelts. We need to get ready for the demand for us to all chip in and be part of a broader and bigger community of caregiving. At Family Caregivers of BC, there are three things that we know that is really important to offer, and that the story is also that people don't ask for help very well. We usually, all of us, it's human nature, we wait until a crisis hits and we go, oh my God, I need help. Ah, your hair's falling out. And if we're doing our jobs well over the next little while, we'll get better and better at saying, hey, Brenda, you have a neighbor or friend. Let's encourage each other to get help and get equipped sooner. So prepare to care is the first theme. So telling stories and preparing to care. And preparing to care is as little as saying, what is this all about? Is my family ready? Have we had those difficult conversations, or easy, about what we want in our future? I asked my dad, let's talk about it. I have all the materials. I have everything you've ever wanted to know. My family starts to go, Barb, here she goes again. Well, do we have an advanced care plan? Let's get to know what our wishes are. They're very important. If something happens to us and we can't speak for ourselves, it's our family that's going to do it. And if you don't talk about it, same thing with dementia. You think about, well, what if? What are your wishes? You've got some time to prepare and have those conversations, which is a blessing. In other conditions, you might not have that time. So preparing to care becomes very important. And so when you think about Family Caregivers of BC, the third thing is that no one is ever alone. There is always a friendly, knowledgeable ear at the other end of the BC Caregiver support line that you can call and talk to. You don't have to know what's what. You don't have to know why you're calling, and it's very common. Hi, my doctor said to call, and so I did. I don't even know where to start. So you just start with a conversation. And I know that one of our, in terms of partnerships, which is another theme that we know is very, very important in the nonprofit sector and in primary care and acute care, long-term care, we're going to get better and better about working together, about helping each other share services. Did you know about? You could go here, you could do this. But First Link is one of our most used referrals in our partner organization of the Alzheimer Society. And we're very grateful that you exist and specialize in all things dementia, which we do not. So we are the generalist specialists on caregiving, and for every disease and condition, we are so grateful when we have someone to refer to. So communities wrapping around each other, helping each other access and ask questions and ask for help earlier. Because the science of asking for help is if you get help sooner, you're less likely to crash and burn. So if you imagine a chart or a graph where it's going up, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine, the crisis hits and boom, what happens? You do crash and burn. If we're smart, we'll help each other, all of us together, avoid that crash and burn because it doesn't serve anybody well. We also have education, again on that general thing. Caregiving is about grief, it is about loss, it is about guilt, and it is about anger. And those are the things that can get bottled up and really, really cause problems. The flip side is it's about love, it's about commitment, it's about duty, it's about digging deep and saying, I think I can do it one more day. And you do, and you go, I did pretty good today. And that there are many, many ups and downs. There's no straight line from the beginning to end of care. And that through that time, you are continuously learning. And both of you mentioned that change in relationship. Sometimes it's harder because you're caring for a spouse. You have lost intimacy sometimes. You're going through some things that you wouldn't have to go through, that a son or a daughter would have to go through. And that understanding that the differences are there, but the commonalities are there, that by relationship, most of us, and I say most, but not all, choose to care. It feels not like a choice sometimes, right, Brenda? It's like, I just got to do this. It's what I do. I love my mom. I love my dad. But at the end of the day, there's degrees of choice, and that to recognize that is pretty freeing. And that you're not alone. That's my final theme. that you're better together with someone if you have just one good friend, just one good ear, just one good support group, just one something, just one good coffee, that you always do better as a human being if you share the care. And that if you prepare to care, share the care, and accept help, you're going to do an awful lot better. And that to know you're not alone, because you're not. So I again, thank you for sharing and telling your stories. And this podcast series is beautiful. I listen to a lot. And we're going to help get the word out. The more people that hear stories, the more we're going to break down barriers, the more we're going to address stigma and walk a mile in someone's shoes who's been brave enough to share their mile.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Barb. And one of the phrases that really jumped out at me that you said was the community of caring. And isn't it interesting how we can think of care as sort of the capital C word, right? Like the health care, the community care. But there's also the lowercase c. I care, you care, my neighbor cares, our family cares, our friends care. And so that concept of building that community of caring, I think, is such a profound one. And you're right, it starts by sharing our stories, to put up our hand and say, I need some help. Or even just to say, this is what happened to me today. And somebody will say, how can I help? That's the beautiful part about that community of caring. So thank you for that. Speaking of sharing stories, it's my great privilege to introduce our next speaker, Victoria resident Brenda Brophy. Brenda Brophy is a storyteller, but she's also many other things. And I'm going to share a little bit about her story and then let Brenda do the rest. Brenda used to visit her 100-year-old mom, Dorothy Finnerty, or Dot, to those who were close to her, nearly every day in her long-term care home. But then the pandemic hit. And in Brenda's words, 7 months of basic isolation in her room with no activities and months with no visitation. And when I was allowed to see her, it was for 45 minutes every 2 weeks. Her mom's mental and physical health declined during the time where she couldn't visit her. Dot's weight loss during the first few months of isolation was significant. She went down from 98 pounds to 65 pounds in July of 2020, so just over a course of a few months. The challenge was that Brenda was no longer able to spend time with her mom, to bring her meals, to help her with eating, and Dot lost interest in eating. Her dementia also quickly worsened, according to Brenda. These are her words. She was always laying in bed. There was nothing to do. The music isn't on. The TV isn't on. Imagine that's your reality. So Brenda started a Facebook support group for others with loved ones in similar situations. And in September 2020, Brenda pulled her mom out of long-term care to live at home. She believes the move saved Dot's life, and the quality of her mom's life was rich with love, music, and shared time together. Now, in addition to being a storyteller and a daughter, Brenda is a dedicated advocate for the rights of seniors, having dealt with home care, long-term care, and visitation restrictions throughout the pandemic. With her mom, Brenda recorded a lot of tender, funny, and challenging moments, and you heard some of those clips earlier today. You can hear their story in episode 1 of the Call to Mind podcast. And although Brenda's mom passed away last July, Brenda continues to reflect on the experience and provides ongoing support to others who are in similar situations. For Brenda, the podcast brought comfort, joy, and tears, remembering with gratitude the time spent with her mom at home. So Brenda, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here again to talk about our story. Believe it or not, before all this happened, and certainly before I met Debra and Voices in Motion, if anybody had said I'd ever speak publicly or sing, I would have said, well, you're crazy. Those are two things I don't do. But as I found out, I would do anything for my mom. My mom was my best friend. So the only way to really talk about this is to talk about, as someone said to me who was interviewing me once, it's really a love story. And it was. So as many people now, it's kind of normal to start having families later in life, but it wasn't back in the 60s. My mom was in her mid-40s when she had me. So what that meant was that I was really an only child. My brothers were already gone, and I was the only girl. So yes, I was the pampered princess in our family, but my mom and I were best friends. I can remember sort of a point in time in my adolescence where I realized that not everybody had an amazing mom who they worshiped and were best friends with. I had friends who adored my mom, but they were not necessarily on great terms with their moms, and I could never really understand it because my mom was the best. She was funny, she never cared about her house, she wanted to play. My mom was never negative, never depressed. I think I saw my mom cry maybe twice. One of them, it was my own fault. I was a rotten teenager and didn't come home one night, and I made my mom cry. And as I sat in the hospital with her in the final days of her life, I remember trying to think of how many things I had to apologize for. And I only came up with about 3, and one of them was that. And I remember telling her that, and she kind of grinned at me. I could tell she was laughing. She was the happiest person in the world, and if more people could have her outlook and disposition, the world would be a better place. So fast forward through my life, as I said, I always had her there. She was there when my first child was born. She was the best. 2012 is the year and moment that life changed forever. It's one of those freeze frame moments where I think anybody who has a loved one with dementia or Alzheimer's, they have that moment of awareness where everything kind of stands still and you realize something is wrong. At that point in time, my husband and I and my children had moved to Australia, and I used to phone my mom every week, have great conversations. She even came and visited me in Australia. And I would come home every 6 months or so, maybe 8 months, and my first thing was to land in Vancouver and get to the island to go see my mom. And I showed up one evening, and my mom met me at the door, looking at me kind of funny, and said, "Oh, where have you been?" And it was, I still remember, it was like the hair stood up on the back of my neck, and it was so confusing because normally she would fly downstairs and kind of launch into my arms as soon as I arrived. So that was the start of what would be a 9-year journey for the two of us through all the different layers that you go through when somebody is diagnosed with what later through that time we found out, or they said she had Alzheimer's. Now, interesting, I argued with doctors quite regularly because I didn't believe my mom had Alzheimer's. I knew she had dementia, and her dementia, she just had absolutely no short-term memory, and it got worse over time, and the repeating like you talked. But I really didn't think it was Alzheimer's, but I was like, okay, fair enough. We won't argue anymore about that. And I did go to workshops put on by the Alzheimer Society because in the early days, I wanted to research and know everything that there was to know because that was how I dealt with it. For us, the trajectory and the rate of decline was very, very slow. I could barely, didn't really notice differences. The repeating got to be a little bit more and the memory was a little bit worse, but she always knew who I was. One of the things I would say to doctors is don't ever tell a daughter that it's unlikely that her mom will forget her. Because that was one of my questions with gerontologists when she'd be assessed every year is, do you think my mom will forget me one day? Because I'd worked with women who'd had that experience. And to me, there wasn't anything more unimaginable than my mom not knowing me. They always said, well, your mom was in her 90s when it came on, so probably not. She probably wouldn't forget her children. Grandchildren might fade, great-grandchildren. So I really went on thinking that my mom was never going to forget who I was. And that's probably one of the most emotional and worst things that I ever went through was that first day of my mom genuinely not knowing who I was. I could tell by the look on her face. So that was the start of it in 2012. I was able to keep my mom living at home for the next 5 years. And I finally managed to move back to Canada, although only to Alberta at that point. But I managed my mom's care from a distance. So when you said I've been through all the layers of every kind of, support and program out there, we did home care. Anyone dealing with that knows that there's some challenges and things that could be fixed in that system. We did meal deliveries, and then I got to the point where I was making meals and delivering them once a month. So there was lots going on, but it stayed pretty steady for a while. Then my mom's challenges in her personal care were things that couldn't be managed by home care. And really at that point, we couldn't think of any options other than moving her into long-term care and bringing her to Victoria, which is where I lived. She was up island and there wasn't anybody else that could care for her. I kind of sold it to her as a way to get closer to me. And it was at that point in our start, it was the next sort of layer in our journey together was long-term care. And I would rather focus on the positive and not talk much about what we went through with that. But the benefit of that was that I did go in every day, pretty much every day. I might miss a day here and there, or if I went on a very short holiday, but I was always in touch. And the thing about that is when I hear the word burden, I kind of cringe, and I know that it's perceived that way by some. I never ever felt it was a burden because I love spending time with my mom. We would just, we would do jigsaw puzzles, we would hang out together, we would have fun, and the changes were very, very slow. Fast forward to the fall of 2007, and this was actually just before she moved into long-term care. She has an older sister who will be 104 this summer who doesn't have dementia. So my auntie is, again, she was my mom's sister, but more like a twin. They were not very far apart in age. So she would come every year for a visit. And one September, it was actually the evening of my birthday, we were having dinner. And my mom at that point was lots of repeating, couldn't remember everything. It was hard on her sister because her sister didn't have those issues, so trying to understand. One of them sang the line of a song, and then they both broke into song. And then my cousin, who was there, she quickly got her phone out and Googled, found the song and hit play, and the two sisters started singing. We ended up staying up till midnight that night singing. And I had a notebook and I started writing down what all these songs were because I didn't know them. Why would I know all these old songs from the 20s and 30s? Kept a list, and then later on I put together, I thought, well, I wonder how you would find this music. Spotify is like magic. Everything I found, even including an old song that was her favorite from the 20s, was available on Spotify, so I made a playlist. And then some of those daily tasks that drove me crazy became really manageable, and I think of music as this, it was like a magic elixir to her dementia, because something as simple as going to a doctor's appointment used to make me crazy because it would just be the repeated questions and some of the frustration I would start to feel. So I would plug in my phone, hit play, and we would sing the whole way. Right about the same time, my husband saw an article in the paper about Voices in Motion and said, hey, look at this. And to us, it was like, oh, other people are realizing that music is really good when you have dementia. Imagine that. So we went to the concert and I was in touch with Debra, and that's where our connection and our friendship began, and we joined Voices in Motion, and I was horrified. I was like, oh, I'll take my mom, but I'm not singing. And they're like, yes, you will. And I was like, oh, no, I won't. And then it was such a happy thing for my mom, and it was so touching to be with all the other people in the choir. Some of that fear went away too, and it became this thing that connected us. So every week I would pick her up at her long-term care home and we would drive out and join the choir. So that was the beginning of the music, and that became a theme. And the interesting part was it wasn't like that was something in our home all the time. I wouldn't have thought of it if it hadn't been for that evening with her sister. And it was just very spontaneous how that all came to be. So that for the next 3 years, things were pretty steady. I had to help out in long-term all the time. I was always there, but again, it wasn't a burden. I was just hanging out with my mom. And if I didn't make her meal, she wouldn't eat. So that became a regular thing where I just took a meal, sat there, and made sure that she was socially engaged and things were going along fine. Then fast forward to 2020. We all know what happened in 2020. I remember thinking when I knew that the lockdown was coming, that it would be 2 incubation periods. I was listening to the news and reading what I could, and I thought, okay, this is okay. It's like 28 days, 4 weeks, that's all it will be. The interesting part of my husband, who, hello, Peter, he's listening from Australia right now where he's visiting his mom. We raced in because the director of the facility phoned me and let me know that 6 o'clock that night the doors were locking. And I have never been so panicked in my life. Got there, and the interesting part about that was my mom had no ability to process information or retain information. But I sat in front of her and held her hands and stared into her eyes and told her that, because I kept talking about the virus, we'd had to cancel her 100th birthday party, which was just a tragedy to all of us at that point. And I told her that I wouldn't be able to come visit her every day. And she just looked at me and I said, well, it's because of the virus. And she said, so you won't be able to come here and visit me? And I said, no, that's right, I won't be able to come. Well, how long will that last for? And I said, you know, just a couple of weeks. I knew that I was lying, but I thought it wouldn't be more than 4. And about every few minutes, my husband and I were getting her room ready and doing different things. She would say, so you're not going to be able to come visit me every day. Half an hour went by, so you're not going to be able to come visit me. And I was amazed that she could take that nugget, because it had such an emotional connection for her, and retain that information. So for the first little while, things went okay because we FaceTime, her caregivers were wonderful, and then that started to fade. The regular caregivers were burning out, they weren't there all the time. I wasn't able to be in touch with her. Finally, the first time I saw her, even though I would phone her all the time, she would tell me she was doing fine, but my mom was, again, the happiest person in the world. And by the time I saw her, she was only 65 pounds, like a shell of her former self. And every time I phoned, she was laying in bed, and she would say, well, there's nothing else to do. And even though I had set up her music and I had posters up in her room, and I was begging them, could you please just turn the music on? Can you make sure there's something going on? There just wasn't that capability at the time with the challenges inside the facility. So after the long fight, it was only, I guess, 6.5, 7 months in, I knew, and I felt very strongly that if I didn't move my mom out, it was going to kill both of us. She was going to die, and my husband actually said to me, you can't do this any longer, because he saw me every morning. I would wake up, sometimes my pillow was already down from the tears I'd be crying in my sleep, because I felt so helpless and hopeless, and I was unraveling. I didn't know what else I could do. If you were watching the news, you might have seen me on the news. I rallied, started petitions. I fought, and nothing was going to change. So we pulled her out, and in quite quick order, we brought her into our home, and that's how the full-time 24/7 caregiver journey, the next chapter in our time together, began. But in the end, I am grateful. I'm grateful for the pandemic. I'm grateful that I was locked out. I'm even grateful that I couldn't become an essential visitor, because I got that last 10 months with my mom. And even seeing her every day in long-term care, I didn't have that much quality time. And although it was incredibly challenging, there was so much magic and so much joy. And 95% of the time, I would say, she was happy and everything was great until it wasn't. And then in the end, we were still able to be in the hospital together, and I was able to be at her side. When I was asked to be involved in the podcast, I really had no idea. I remember having calls with Suzanne and Debra, and I was like, okay, I guess I can record some stuff, but I would forget, and then I would do it, and I think, I don't know what the purpose of this is. And then when I was able to finally bring myself to listen to the podcast, it was sometime after I had lost her. I didn't know if I could, and then I was just so grateful, and grateful again that I had that time with her, because our memories, and because it was still during the pandemic, it was my husband and I and my mom and our 2 dogs, and we had so much fun. And I would say my husband and I are incredibly close, but it brought us even closer together, because we really were a team, and I couldn't have done it. So when we talk about support, I know that I couldn't have done it without him. I have my 2 adult kids at a distance, but I was raised, my mom was of that generation where you just pull yourself up by the bootstraps and get on with it. You don't cry, you don't whinge about things, you don't certainly go and tell strangers your story. My mom used to see us on the news when reporters would come knocking, and we'd turn the news on for fun. And the first time she saw herself on the screen, it wasn't long after we'd moved her in. The first reporter came in after I'd moved her out of long-term care, and she looks at the TV screen and she goes, "What the hell?" So I'm quite sure that she would probably just be horrified if her singing was now, forever out there in the podcast universe. But we had all those moments, and we wouldn't have had all of that if we hadn't have had that time together. I wish I would have maybe understood or known it a little bit more, or maybe I don't. Maybe I would have just been scared and anxious right from the beginning, but it was, you do what you have to do. And I had neighbors around, but again, because of the pandemic, we weren't letting anybody else in the house. I did manage to get caregivers to come in and help as well, but the journey was amazing. And through all of it, music played a huge part. my mom started her day with "Oh, What a Beautiful Morning," and then her playlist was 4 hours and 52 minutes long by the time I was able to find all those old songs that still will get stuck in. My husband would be like, "Oh no, don't play that one." Because I'd be like, no, it's going to be stuck. And then it would come on and I'd be like, sorry. And whenever my mom got a song stuck in her head, it was kind of for the whole household to get as well. So we can't do anything without being a community and not supporting each other. And when I first heard the podcast, I kind of cringed and thought, ooh, I can't believe that something this intimate and personal is out there in the world. But since then, I've realized it's okay to be vulnerable and to tell your story, and it's the only way that we really can get the point across. And lots of people, since I've done that, have come up to me and talked to me about it and are having their own struggles as well. So I've come to feel like it's okay. It's okay to get out there, to be vulnerable and to tell your story. And as my daughter, who is just finishing a master's in social work, told me, or she told me when I phoned her, when we knew that my mom was dying, I called to be very brave and strong to her, because that's what my mom always was. And I wanted to give her the choice if she wanted to fly home and see her grandma one more time. And I immediately fell apart. And she said, I can be there for you. And then she told me later she'd never been more proud of me because I actually asked for help. And she'd never in her entire life ever seen me ask for help. And I don't think I had either. So it's taught me to be vulnerable, to ask for help sooner, and understand that we are one big community and we have to support each other. So I appreciate being able to share that story.
And we're so glad that you did, Brenda. So thank you so much. And thank you to each of you for sharing your thoughts, your observations on this incredibly important topic. And thank you to all of you who are here today. And this is a shameless plug. If you see me looking at my phone, it's not that I'm checking the hockey score. We're actually collecting your questions. So if you are joining us online, please use the Q&A function. You'll have an opportunity to ask those questions now, and we're going to try and feed them in a few minutes. And similarly, if you're here with the index cards, please jot down a couple questions. We'll come around and do our best to answer as many of them as we can. Brenda, as you were speaking, one of the things that was coming up in my head was just how the memories may go, but the emotions and the connection stays.
Yeah, they absolutely do.
Yeah, and I was just struck by that, and just like the joy that you were able to experience with each other.
And I actually wanted to say that because that was something I learned through the whole journey, is understanding dementia, is that the person is always there. And I think too often I saw it with different family members that I would see in long-term care, visiting their person and not necessarily being comfortable, but in understanding that, like, my mom was always my mom. Those feelings of grief that I would go through when another piece of her was kind of gone, when she couldn't relate to me or remember who I was, I would grieve that. But underneath it all, there was often times in the evening, I always sat on the edge of her bed and we sang "You Are My Sunshine" before it was lights out. And in that moment, because she would look at me and very tenderly put her hand on my leg and ask me if I could soon go to bed myself because I looked tired. And she would show empathy for me and ask me if I was okay. And I always kind of knew by the look on her face that she was fully aware that I was there and I was very familiar. And even in the hospital, when she was particularly angry about people poking and prodding at her, I was leaving and she was having nothing to do with me either. And it was all a new experience for me because she just wasn't happy, wasn't cooperating. But I leaned down anyways on my way out the door, and she wanted me gone. She was just wanted everybody out of her room. And we always said, I love you a whole big bunch. And I leaned down and I said, Mom, I love you. And she muttered, whole big bunch. And she was mad, but she knew, and she was like determined. She didn't know who I was. She didn't know why she was there. She was just mad as a little hornet. But in that moment, she still said the same thing. So her emotion when I said, I love you, was exactly the same response I would get when she was happy. But, even in that moment, so they're always who they are. It just gets really buried. And it's important to remember that even in those times where it's really, really hard.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And one of the things that I was also struck by today as well is just that in having these conversations, we are helping to change the conversation. We talk about caregiving, we talk about the experience of having a family member or a loved one affected by dementia. This is how we change the conversation around how we talk about it and how we respond to it. And so I just, again, want to thank you all. And I would also say too, to anybody who's here, who's joining us on the live cast today, if you yourself have questions, maybe you have a story you want to share, or maybe you're looking for support, please don't hesitate to reach out. I mean, Barb mentioned already some of the great resources that are available through Family Caregivers of BC. We have the First Link program here at the Alzheimer Society of BC as well. Isabel's office does some fantastic work on behalf of BC seniors. And just really want to encourage you to reach out to share your story too. So we are moving to our Q&A portion of the evening. I think we're going to take a quick lightning fast stretch break. Or are we going to go right into it?
I don't want to upset the earpiece.
Just listen today.
Lose the mic down.
Okay. What is the score? What is the score? Is it the big game between
it's
Edmonton
the Battle
and
of
Calgary?
Alberta.
Okay.
I'm not checking it. I'm seriously, I got questions here. I wasn't kidding.
I know I was on the Teams call this morning, and everybody was in Calgary but me, and there was already some
family there. Okay.
Well, yeah, I'm actually working for a company out of Alberta right now, so it's quite funny to listen to them, and I'm like, I don't actually care, but okay, go Flames.
Oh, it's quite a rivalry.
I'll say though, it's a fun town when the hockey games are on though, because they're a dedicated fan base. They're kind of like the Habs and the Leafs.
All right. So we're gonna bring it on back, folks. So I'm gonna take your attention again. We've got some great questions that have come through, and again, I promise I'm not actually checking the hockey scores on my phone. Isabel, this question is for you. First of all, the person starts off by saying, thank you for being a wonderful advocate for seniors and particularly for long-term care. Yeah, right? And particularly long-term care residents and their families during the pandemic. It was disheartening that our provincial health officer did not follow your report recommendations in the fall of 2020. Do you believe that BC needs to create a ministry of long-term care?
Well, there's Ontario has a Ministry of Long-Term Care. It doesn't solve all your problems. I don't know that it. I'm not sure what problems it would solve by virtue of being a ministry. I think the bigger issue here, it isn't about an individual. It is about a culture in our system writ large, in our healthcare system and in our long-term care system, where we don't value the role of the family in supporting the patient or the resident. It's part of that bigger picture. When you think about it, the things that were done with the best of intentions. It wasn't done to be mean to people. It was done to protect people, right? We did lose the plot. Protect them for what, from what? But I think it was a lack of understanding or a lack of humility on our part as clinicians to sort of understand we weren't as pivotal for some of the residents. You have to remember, we part of the challenge was we just took a total cookie cutter approach to it. We didn't distinguish between the residents who had family members like Brenda and the residents who had a family member who came once every 2 weeks. They're two different things, frankly. I mean, the one who comes every 2 weeks, she's going to want to say how valuable she is to her. Okay, it's not the same as the person who comes every day. We could have done it differently, but what we did was it's this paternalistic approach that we take in long-term care toward the residents, and we elbow out the family members. It's paternalistic to the family members as well. So I think it's more, so I don't think a ministry of long-term care solves that.
No, thanks for sharing your thoughts on that one. I know it's a nuanced issue, but a one that we need to address. This next question I'm going to pose to you, Barb. And this person is sharing their personal experience. They're saying, I feel like I'm drowning. My mom has some level of dementia. She can't feel her feet. She has no filters. My brother and I don't see eye to eye on what needs to be done. And this is all gut-wrenching, heartbreaking, and overwhelming. How am I supposed to cope with all of the above on my own?
I would say first, don't cope on your own. I would pick up that phone, and Licia is here in the room today, and she's our caregiver support manager, and I think I would in a heartbeat want to talk to Licia or someone like Licia. And I know First Link, you have amazing responses there too, but getting the conversation going about what are my options? First of all, I have feelings about it, anger. Brothers not, there are family dynamics in all of our families. They're not easy. Starting the conversation with somebody who is skilled, trained, and understands what you're going through, where you have no judgment. You can just talk to somebody and just go blah, blah, let it all out. You can say anything, and that's a great place to start. And that is why we have support lines. That's someone who's walked a mile, who understands. You start from there, and sometimes that's where clarity starts with. You don't need to know all your steps ahead of you. You need to know one step. And sometimes you don't need to know any steps if at least you can get it off your chest. And again, thinking about the good research about how we process and how we manage so much up in our head is we have to get it out to begin to organize. And that's one of the things we do. There's no expectation that you can solve and make your plan all at once. Just start with one step. And that one step is take a step. So we've got the support lines, and we're very lucky in Canada, actually. We're lucky to have Isabel and her team with the office, the seniors advocate, because not a lot of provinces and territories even have two in Canada. There are 4 organizations like ours, a provincial caregiver support organization, and we want to grow that. There are over 40 caregiver support programs locally to reach out to, and that's what we do. What do you have in your community? Reach out, let's have a chat, let's talk, and go from there.
No, thank you for sharing your thoughts on that one, Barb. And I love your first opener there is like, you don't have to do it on your own. You really don't. Brenda, I'm going to punt this one over to you because I think this is someone who could benefit from your lived experience. What steps do you think a family or children should take to prepare for care of their mom and dad with dementia living on their own? They were sharing a little bit about the fact that their mom is changing, their mom's capacity is changing. We found a private residence care with limited resources for people with dementia and will not take them. We're searching for next steps. So they're 2 children are trying to figure out what they can do. Any words of wisdom there?
Oh boy, that's really a complex one. I would hope that they have reached out to the Alzheimer Society to kind of navigate and understand what they're dealing with as far as the dementia goes. That was really important for me. What I've found, and I know some friends in this situation right now, is there's a quick sort of knee-jerk reaction when something's going on with mom and dad to quickly start taking on that parent role with them and kind of, kind of enforcing their own ideas about what should happen next. And I think that sometimes that's a bit of a mistake. My mom was pretty easy, my dad wouldn't have been. So there's different dynamics with that. And I think that it gets very complicated when there's certainly a husband and wife. And when I attended the Alzheimer's workshops, I actually went away realizing how lucky I really was because my mom wasn't that bad. And everyone there was dealing with a husband and wife team, their parents, or it was a spouse, and that adds so many layers to it. Probably the parents are at different levels, and if they both have dementia. But I think knowing as much as they can about what's available in the community, and depending if their parents are at the point where they can have conversations, but them trying to force their will of what they think and moving into that parent role and telling their parents what they're going to need to do is probably not helpful if it's early stages, but certainly getting help and reaching out and getting them some help in the community. Maybe they can stay at home longer, not just immediately go into care.
Yeah.
If I could add to that, we're really fortunate now in Victoria, the downtown urgent primary care center has a memory loss clinic that's open 2 days a week. The Alzheimer Society has a presence there. They're trying to provide more comprehensive care and help make it so that when people get a diagnosis of memory loss, of dementia, whatever the cause is, that it's fully explored and that they're connected to resources rather than being kind of left stunned with this diagnosis and feeling a bit helpless and hopeless.
Yeah, get information.
So then you have a team that's kind of helping to navigate this unknown terrain, because everybody's Alzheimer's trajectory is, or dementia trajectory can be different depending on what's causing it. And so we don't know what that's going to look like. It can be unpredictable, and we need support to begin to plan for that.
Yeah, thank you for adding that, Deborah. I think it's important information for people to understand that there is a multidisciplinary memory clinic right here in Victoria. There's 2 in the province that are like this structure, and we have one in Nanaimo, one in Victoria, so pretty fortunate in that regard. But thank you so much for your comments on that one. I'm going to sneak this last question in here because I think it's a biggie, and I would love to open it up to all of you. So this question is around what can we, so the big we, caregivers, health authorities, academics, governments, NGOs, what can we do to influence the creation of a national caregiver strategy? Maybe Isabel, I can start with you first, but I'd love to hear everybody's thoughts on this one.
Well, you probably don't want to hear what I have to say about it.
I do.
Because I don't know what this national caregiver strategy would look like, because there's such a diversity out there, right, of what, and national strategies, we talk about it, there's got to be a national streamers, that's sort of, when you look at any of these strategies that get developed, they're always very broad and they're always very aspirational. And at the end of the day, it comes down to the question from the brother and sister that Brenda was talking about, right? What it comes down to at the end of the day is, how am I going to support my husband, my wife, my mom, or my dad through this journey? And everybody's is different for a whole lot of reasons. Depending on how old they are and what else is going on with their body. I think the focus, I think I'm more practically inclined, and I think the focus has to be around making sure that there's someone that brother and sister can go to and talk to who will be the honest broker of, okay, here are the decisions you need to make, and here's what's available for you. I think at the end of the day, there's some things we can fix and there's some things we can't fix. One of the easiest things to fix is when the only impediment is money. So one of the things that I see is that while the amount of money you have at 95 isn't going to change your health, it's going to change the options you have available to you about how to deal with whatever has come down the road. And how do we make sure that people in the community have the help, the resources that they need, and it's going to look different for different people, to support their loved one, so that when and if the time comes to go into a care home, that decision is being made because it is where it needs to be. Whether it's because there's no adult children living in the city for any variety of reasons, and not because we can't, it isn't working to have 3 different home support workers come and half the time they don't show up. Right? That's what so I'm more practically inclined. So the questioner didn't hear what they wanted to from me. I'm sorry about that.
No, I love that. I love that.
To get at that one.
And Barb, I see you're like rubbing your hands in glee.
I am.
Too, so I want to go to you next. I want to get your thoughts on
thank
this
you,
one.
Jen, because this is something we've been working on intensively for the last 5 years, if not longer. But a big shout out to the Ministry of Health, Patients as Partners Division, who has provided us with funding to do a number of different things, and in particular during COVID, some emergency money to just expand and to be able to offer more direct support in the moment. What we've been working on is what we call caregiver-friendly healthcare, advancing person and family-centered care, and we focused on a caregiver RX, or caregiver prescription project. And through all of the research, synthesis, and all of the work been done in the world, we've broken it down into 3 steps. And rather than a broad-based, what did you call it, Isabel? It sounds nice, but doesn't have any. It's aspirational. This is good. We all need aspirations, do we not? But we also need concrete, good, realistic next steps to get busy doing the doing. Mm-hmm. And that is the identification, referral, and inclusion of caregivers as partners in care. And those 3 can be, that is our strategy. So if we break that down, we say right now, what is the real problem? In addition to culture, because we've mentioned culture today, it is a system that only recognizes the patient. The system doesn't have mechanisms, processes, structures, policy that know what to do with us caregivers. We're not the client in the industry of healthcare. We are not the client, the patient is. So in order to fix that, we need to use some lessons from COVID. It has really illustrated some huge gaps. For example, if someone is going to go and get a jab at home, and that person at home is at home because the caregiver right there beside them is caring for them, and they're getting a jab right then and there, and then the caregiver goes, oh, what about me? Could I have one too? I need to be healthy. And this is just one crazy example that drives us crazy. It's like, could you just not give Isabel the jab at the same time, and then everybody's covered? No, because you're not in the system, you're not listed, we don't have the medication, and you're not the client. It's like, so you might have heard a lot of CBC stuff around that, and it's just like, okay, it's crazy making. So that's just one illustration of a system that doesn't identify, recognize the role of the caregiver. And then, I'm sorry, I'd like to as a frontline healthcare provider, but I don't have the policy to support it. So we know that we need to identify caregivers, and that once we get some champions on board, we need to embed those changes in the system at different points of care, so that if we could identify, then what else can we do? If we know you exist, we can refer you for support. If I give you a diagnosis as a physician of dementia, immediately I'm going to go, that's you, the patient, and who's with you today? Who drove you? That would be my wife, Brenda. And they say, Brenda, here's a referral for you because your needs are important. You need to prepare to care. And you, person with diagnosis, already have a system in place that addresses your needs because you are the client. So identification, referral for support, and inclusion as a partner in care. And I think we're doing quite well at times of including around the plan of care at that part where you have a family conference to explain when primary care is working well, and you have a family physician, by the way, then that works well. But we won't go there tonight.
That's not this talk tonight.
Yes.
Sorry, guys. That's next week. Next week.
So if we start to get to solutions when we break it down into those 3 categories, and that is the strategy. And it's working well in some pilot stages. We have some excited people going, yeah, that's the right thing to do. We have some physicians pounding, everybody should be making referrals. Why wouldn't we? So there's a lot more to it, but there you go.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much. And I saw some nodding heads over here, Brenda. So I would love to give you the last word. Your thoughts on this one.
Well, and I feel the same way, only I probably wouldn't be quite as politically correct, if I could even say that, is hearing about national standards and all the rest. After having spent as many years as I did fighting the, broken system of long-term care, what I felt was completely inadequate supports through home care, and being, left with a mom who probably could have been on her own, but then couldn't because I didn't have the supports, and all the things I went through. I have read every report that Isabel's office puts out, and I'm tired of the reports, the statistics, the news coverage, all of the talk, and I'm the same. It's like, get on with the doing. And for me, what it is supporting the families, the person with the diagnosis, and giving options, and certainly the funding part. Like, I was lucky, I was able to access a program to get funding to hire staff, but that is not something that the vast majority of people could manage, deal with the application process, the bureaucracy around it. And really, when you look at the money that subsidized long-term care costs the taxpayer, I promise you there are cheaper options. You just need to be flexible, innovative, and have the ability to look at something other than the system we have right now and make some changes, and quit waiting for, you know, politicians at a very high level to do that. We got to build it from, you know, the grassroots level and force that to happen. And the pandemic can't be for nothing. And after what I've seen and what I went through, and the decline I saw not only in my mom but other seniors, and the torture that, when, you know, you mentioned my Facebook group, I think we got up to around 400 people, and the stories, a lot of times I had to just not read them for a day or two because I couldn't sleep when I'd read some of the stories of what people were seeing of their loved ones, what they were going through, and it was because of shutting family out of long-term care. That can't happen again. And one of my favorite things that Isabel said in one of the interviews was, what are we saving them for? There is no quality of life left, so what is the point? You know, we're saving them from COVID to be miserable and die alone from the social isolation. We know what social isolation does. How did we like being locked up and not being able to see friends and family and go to a movie and do things? And we're, you know, cognitively not impaired like somebody in a long-term care facility. So we have the ability to do things different. It just does take the will, and it takes being noisy and not accepting the status quo, which is quite broken, and we need help, and families need the finances, the programs, and the options to be able to find other ways to care for their person outside of long-term care. No one wants to go into long-term care, so why do we keep spending all the money on it and making that the only or the first option that people jump to, rather than it making it a last resort?
Thank you so much for that, Brenda. And I hope if you take anything away from this today, it's that we've started a conversation here, and an important one. And hopefully you feel just a little bit like me today, a little bit fired up. I see some nodding heads in the audience, but maybe a little bit fired up to continue this conversation in your own way, whatever way you can. And so again, I just want to say a sincere thanks to our panelists today, to Brenda, to Barb, to Isabel, for sharing your thoughts, contributing to the discussion. I know it's something that at the Alzheimer Society of BC is near and dear to our hearts, around this concept of changing the practice around how we support people who are living with dementia and their families. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to turn it back over to Debra to bring us home for the evening.
It's been a fast hour and a half. I just want to pass out a little gift, a thank you to all our panelists for spending your time with us tonight and talking about these issues.
Thank you.
So
Thanks,
I also,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
yeah, I also want to, oh, no.
No,
hold on.
No.
Nope. It wasn't for me. It's okay. It's okay.
So I want to particularly thank our production and editing team. Suzanne Ahern is in the back, and she gets some flowers. And also, if Jenny Shine could stand up, she was our producer, and she did a lot of the editing, a lot of hours. Amazing storyteller, and brought in David Parfit, who provided a bit of the background, the soundtrack, our sound designer. I also just want to acknowledge, although they aren't here, Cindy McDowell, who was a graduate research assistant in psychology, Matilda Cervantes, a graduate student in social dimensions of health, Ruth Campen in sociology, and Karen Duyela, who provided immeasurable support in helping us get these recordings and helping provide technical support. Jim Mann was a consultant. He's an advocate living with Alzheimer's and helped us steer the course because people really trusted us with their stories, and we wanted to make sure that we had his input as well. I want to thank Dr. Stuart McDonald in the back there, who's been fielding questions. He's a professor in the Department of Psychology here at UVic. Leah Potter here from the Institute on Aging and Lifelong Health. And our two volunteers, Chanel and Angela, if you could stand up and wave. And then I want to acknowledge our partners and funders. Just a quick slide there to look at. If you want more information on the Call to Mind podcast, you can, oops, it was up there. I think is it up there? Sorry, the slides may be out of order. Skip to the end, please. Yeah, sorry, it took us a minute with the visuals. And forward. I want to acknowledge our podcast participants. If there are any, could you stand up, please? If you could stand up, podcast participants. We've got Wendy and we've got Brian and Margie. And if you could give each of them a bouquet. And of course, Brenda, who gets a bouquet as well. And I went to visit Daphne and Mickey today. They weren't able to attend tonight, but they may be listening online, and I dropped them off a bouquet. They trusted us with their stories. It takes a lot of courage to be that vulnerable and kind of, like Brenda said, didn't know what was going to come out of this. And I think a bit of magic because of Jenny's storytelling skills and editing. So thank you so much for spending your evening with us. And I hope you'll get a chance to listen to the podcast and tell other people about it. You'll be getting a survey tomorrow asking for your feedback. One of the things that I'm working on right now is creating a bit of a guide to help other caregivers of people either living with memory loss or just with physical disabilities capture some stories. And I'm really eager to find out whether or not you have an interest, whether or not there's interest in doing that, having the support to begin to do some short audio recordings to capture those voices and stories. So look for that in your email box and please respond and let us know if there's an interest. And lastly, what Brenda was saying about music being so important, there are really easy ways to create it so that you can access music with your voice by creating playlists like on Amazon Echo, which actually has a visual and will give you lyrics. And you can just say, Alexa, play my playlist. And it will come up. And I'm eager to see if there's more interest in learning how to do that kind of thing, because I think it really can improve the quality of life. As we saw with Brenda's mom, she could easily play things. She was using Spotify because her fire
stick. Yeah, the fire
starter. Anyway, the Amazon device doesn't play well with Spotify, but it plays well with Amazon Music. So it's like trying to cut across these devices. But there's ways that, we can help improve the quality of life by bringing more joy into our lives with the people that we love. So that's it for tonight. Feel free to stick around and ask more questions if you'd like, but thank you for joining us.